Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the interesting and complicated tangles that we deal with as humans, of course, is dealing with other humans and energy exchange with other people. And if you're someone who's energetically sensitive, intuitive, if you carry the archetype of the healer, if you tend to run a little high in stress state, all of these things are going to add complexity to the equation in different ways. And so I want to break this down because I'm someone who had a lot of lack of success early on with having successful energy exchanges with people. Some of that was discernment, some of that was lack of skill. And it's something that works beautifully in my life today. And it just had to do with being able to break down all the different aspects of it so that I could deal with each one of them appropriately and understand the agendas and kind of what part of me was talking or engaged when I committed or didn't commit to something that someone wanted from me, or when I made the choice to ask or not ask. And there's a little bit of a peripheral adjacent conversation about the dangers of projecting what we think people will want or what we think people will do too much of the time. There's a certain discernment of saying, okay, probably this person might not be available for this thing as a reasonable starting place, but sometimes people swing the pendulum way too far and they get way, way, way too far in the heads of other people. And it's kind of an effort to control and keep track of everything that's going on. And I really get that, but I'm not going to go so much into that. I just want to acknowledge it as a adjacent conversation or concept to the things I am going to talk about. So when it comes to my energetically sensitive, spiritually inclined kind of people, very often when they're in a good space, that means they're resourced and they're happy and they have enough of important things like safety and connection and, things are generally going well. There's a lot of correlation to that demographic of wanting everyone else to be well. So when you have these activated, open upper chakras, the heart chakra is open, you're connected to your crown chakra, may we all be well is something that has innate value for you. It's something that lives inside of you. And so there's a tendency to want, in general, for people to have the things they want, the things that would make them happy. And if you have high levels of empathy or you carry the archetype of the healer, this volume on this aspect that I think we all carry gets turned up even more. And the desire for the people you care about to have the things they want is a strong influence. And one of the things that's important about this is to just recognize it, honor the beauty of it, but provide it with enough adult supervision so it doesn't run off and commit you to something before it talks to the other chakras. So this is kind of going to be a theme throughout this recording, is that when we decide what we give to other people, when we decide what we open our mouths and commit to, it's really useful to take a pause and understand what part of us wants to move forward with that and whether we can get it signed off. So going back in my history, I worked as an engineer, and I, as an engineer, might have this really cool idea of what I could do with this really cool piece of equipment. And so I would go to my boss and say, hey, I really could use this new piece of equipment that costs money, but it would allow me to do these cool things. And then he would run it by the financial health of the company and the bottom line and what the budget was and everything else, and make a decision about whether he could support that request or whether it was too much resources or too much expense, or whether he wanted to send me back to the drawing board to say, hey, could you find a cheaper option to get this data or information? So there was this balance of the desire to have something that would allow me to do my job better, to accomplish something with the bigger picture. What would it cost the company? What would be the the impact of that. So the shirt off your back analogy, for example, isn't super sustainable because you still end up with somebody without a shirt, and any way you slice it, that's a problem. So in looking at this, when this part of you that's this beautiful, expansive, I want people that I love to have whatever they need. I want humanity in general to have what they need. I want all the animals to be well. I want the environment to be well. These are beautiful parts, and when they're expressed and open, they don't have a natural loop where they talk to the rest of us and say, well, it's great if I help my friend out paying their rent, but am I then going to put myself in a position where I can't pay my rent? And if you would not be able to pay your rent as a result of helping them out, and that was going to be a problem, you didn't have resources for that, you may want to not just hand over a bunch of money in your desire to help them if it's going to harm you. And so there's a need to be able to have a discernment of what we need in our human lives, because we are constrained in space and time. We have budgets, we have how much energy something's going to cost, how much sleep we need, how much energy we need to do our functions. One of the ways that I was a little out of balance early on doing my business is I love to help people when they're in pain and when they're wanting to shift out of that pain and be free of it. Like, that's so alive for me. But it was 10 times more alive for the people who I personally loved. So I had this combination of, oh, I love you, of course I want to support you, and I love this in general. This is the thing that I want to do. And the upshot was I was giving way too much time being the kitchen table counselor to friends and family, and not enough sitting down and taking the action to find people who would pay me for my work, which was completely okay when I was working as an engineer because I didn't need the work that I was doing to support me. But once I shifted out of being an engineer, I realized that there was just a compelling nature of wanting to support the people I love. In fact, there was one relationship that one of the defining things that ended it is I felt like I was the stormy weather friend. So we're familiar with the fair weather friend. That's the person who's around when things are good and nowhere to be seen when things are tough and hard. And it's a certain kind of friendship. It's good to be eyes wide open if you have a fair weather friend. But for this particular friend, I was her stormy weather friend. So when she was happy and having fun and putting together group events, I wasn't necessarily on the list. But boy, she had me on speed dial when she was having a hard night. And I really colluded with that configuration because I wanted the intimacy, I wanted the connection, I wanted to provide that. It's just that it went out of balance, and I was the stormy weather friend, and I wanted a more full spectrum relationship, and that wasn't what was emerging in this particular dynamic. So all of this is to say that, if you are requisitioning your time and your energy and your attention and perhaps giving up sleep to be on the phone with someone you love or to show up for something they need or give them money or whatever it is, there are all these ways that we spend our energy really supporting people, and that's wonderful. That's just the nature of things. But we want to have a really good part of us that's reviewing the requisitions. So rather than just leaping into action, it's really good to have a review team that says, okay, what will it cost me if I take this phone call when I'm already tired? What will it cost me if I leap in the car to help someone out? And it's not like there's an obvious never, ever, ever do that if you're not totally resourced. I think that most of the time we do a lot better if we, have our own cup full before we go filling anyone else's. And there are times when there are these unusual and intense situations that mean that we really do need to put aside what we need in the moment because of what we're called to show up for someone else. Motherhood is a massive example of that. However, I think as a mother, you're going to have more success if you're constantly looking for opportunities to lessen the sleep deficit with a nap and just finding ways to really support yourself and fill up your own cup. And a lot of discernment is necessary when you're running on a budget, because your energy isn't at its fullest expression. And one of the things to remember about the upper chakras is they have something of an infinite nature. Our crown chakra is connected to the part of ourselves that's outside of space and time. Our heart chakra is this infinite and amazing capacity to love, and our third eye is super visionary. We can vision far more than we could ever accomplish in a human lifetime. And so these chakras that aren't so connected to space and time and resources and embodiment and the finite nature are beautiful. They bring beautiful things to the table. However, they need a little feedback on what's realistic and what's not. And so having some of the lower chakras sign off on the requisitions of the energy that you feel excited and inspired to share with other people is a really sensible way to approach this part. So, moving down the chakra system, there are unfortunately woven in some parts of us that are not coming from such a beautiful, expansive space when they go to provide other people with things that we believe that they want, or that they've said that they want, or that they've asked for. And that's where we want to think about the second and the third chakra, specifically the instincts, and the third chakra, the thinking mind, but specifically the thinking mind that executes strategies to meet needs. And when we feel off our center, or our instincts are a little activated, or we have a little fight or flight going on, then there's some strategies that come up for navigating that are not particularly sustainable or optimal or life affirming. And many of us have some strategies that were really good for surviving childhood that are maladaptive and could use some cleanup for our adult lives. And if you have a trauma history, you may just have your fight or flight on at a low level all the time, in which case you may want to check out my podcast on anxiety, because there's a lot to bringing those levels down. And the argument that you might have with yourself about people pleasing is going to be a lot easier to navigate if you're not navigating it on top of fight or flight. So there's a certain need to recognize that, but your executive, cognitive, take a breath, pause, check in with myself is going to be a lot more online and available if the fight or flight isn't activated. So if you've got a lot of fight or flight activation, lay the foundation of starting to systematically drop those levels. And it's a problem that plagues humanity up one side and down the other. So there are many, many, many mindfulness apps and strategies to drop those levels. It's just a matter of being really systematic and learning to notice when that's happening. But one of the things people don't always associate is that the people-pleasing strategy is tied into an instinctual survival strategy. So back in hunter-gatherer times, being thrown out of the tribe was a death sentence. And so we have all of this hardwiring to create stress state when the tribe is displeased with us. And you can see that sometimes in the relationship with animals, for example. Some dogs have a really high level of monitoring whether the human is pleased with them every second. And it really depends on the breed. There are breeds that are like, yeah, if I have a hankering to do something, I'm going to do it. But there are other breeds that really care a lot about human reaction. One of the funny stories that someone told me, he had a German Shepherd and a Husky, and he was doing the training thing where he would put their food down, and then they needed to wait for a signal from him, and maybe 30 seconds later that it was okay to eat. And he said the attitudes were completely different. The German Shepherd was looking at him like, is this what you want? Am I pleasing you? Am I doing what you want? This, am I being good? Am I pleasing you? And the Husky was like, oh, would you just frigging give the command already? This is ridiculous. Screw you. And the attitudes were really, really different. And you can see that in people too. There's a spectrum where people are incredibly apologetic almost for taking up space, and other people who are obnoxiously oblivious to the impact of their actions on others. But for sensitive people and intuitive people, we tend to be more aware when people aren't enjoying us. There's more intensity to the energy. We can't always process it. There are times when we're so overstimulated we can't respond in a meaningful way. But there's a lot of warmer, colder information where we're not even just looking at facial expressions and body cues and responses. We can feel the energy of whether someone's pleased. And so a psychic, empathic, intuitive person is capable of people pleasing at a far more effective and sophisticated level than a normal person. And if you were in a really family that had some harshness to it, or even just a sensitive child kind of with the normal constraints, one of your survival strategies would have been to read everybody's cues really carefully and be pleasing. And as a child, there are a lot of rewards for being pleasing. The good girl, good boy archetype or strategy is well documented in kind of psychological books and things like that. And that was certainly my survival strategy. In terms of my teachers, I was the straight A student, but I was also behaving absolutely within the constraints of what they wanted. I was never prioritizing a desire to connect with my peers over their authority when they said, stop talking. And there's nothing innately right or wrong about that. It certainly made me easier to have in class. I wasn't, creating disruption. But at the same time, it was very much a strategy, and one that benefits from some discernment about how much of a compliant good girl I want to be in any given situation, and how much there's a non-conventional way of moving that would serve me. And so the more sophisticated way that I move through the world is wanting not to bump people unpleasantly, wanting not to do harm, wanting to have a mutuality when I'm sharing space with people, whether it's the grocery store or the freeway, but at the same time holding a reasonable balance of what would really serve and support me and what I'm available to offer to other people. And arguably, if I'm so under-resourced that I can't pay attention to playing nice with others, perhaps I should avoid occupying public space for that period of time. Not that everybody does that, but there's a sophistication, there's a balance of a genuine desire not to annoy people or make their journey harder through selfishness or carelessness, but also not over prioritizing other people's comfort to the point that I might not be speaking up or I might be inauthentic. And this doesn't mean that when you have a tense conversation, there won't be tension in your body, maybe some sweaty palms, maybe a little acceleration of your heartbeat. I don't think that most people enjoy a conversation that says, hey, this isn't working for me, and I have the idea that this may not go over too well when we have this discussion, at least initially. I'm a huge fan of compassionate communication because I feel like it's going to get you the best possible results for needing to negotiate a win-win or possibly a no deal with someone, but doing it in a way that's deeply respectful and deeply honoring of them and gives the best chance of collaboration, assuming that you're dealing with a healthy person, and better results if you're not dealing with a particularly healthy person. So it's a incredibly effective skill set, which I would recommend anyone who struggles with this, because sometimes what we have modeled is people don't speak up, don't speak up, don't speak up. And then when they speak up, they're screaming. They go from zero to screaming. And it ends up being kind of a pick your poison where, either you're swallowing something until it becomes terrible, but then the anger explosion response is so harsh and intense that it damages relationship. And at this point in my life, I have a really high level of saying what I need to the people who are important in my life, and a lot of success with sustaining relationship through it. So coming back around, I just want to really differentiate between the overgiving out of an abundance of generosity, like an unsupervised archetype of the healer, desire to just have the people that you care about be happy in their lives and supply something that could contribute to that, which is a joyful experience. It's just you need a little bit of discernment so that you're doing it in a way that's sustainable for you, being able to still be responsible and balanced in your own life in terms of your money and your health and your time and, what you need. And it's, again, a different conversation, but having a really clear care and feeding manual, know how much sleep you need, know what food you need, know how much alone time you need, know how much social connection you need. All these things are really important. One of the things that I really identified for myself is there were people that I was just in service to personally because I cared about them, but that couldn't be all of my social circle. I needed, because of the nature of how much I give to clients who are coming to me with their problems, and I love that I get to support them, but it means that I can't have a social circle where it's filled with all these people who come to me with their problems, and then, I am constantly providing support socially, which actually was thing that I really had to learn to look at, because one of the strategies that I had was I was super socially awkward for a long time, but as I gained skill in doing this work, I have a lot of capacity to see and hear and acknowledge and support. Like, I'm really, really good at helping people to feel authentically empowered and better and reframe things and mirroring them in a way that shows them their power and their magnificence. And there's just a lot to it, and I love it. I love doing it all the way down to my toes, but I was being a one-trick pony in my relationships because I could build sort of a false intimacy and closeness really fast in a friendship. I'm not talking about a professional session, just I'm hanging around the campfire with someone and they express a pain point and I go into full healer mode and they end up really liking me. They're like, Katie's wonderful. I totally want to hang with her. I got so much out of it. And that felt really good as someone who often felt not particularly liked and left out. But I really had to have a discipline to turn that part of me off so that I could then have a more full spectrum experience. So it's an important thing to note that that may be a strategy, the people pleasing, the overgiving to get people to like you and love you and be in your life. And there's a really great thing to sort of tease yourself away from that so that it's more based on resting affinity. I just made up that as a phrase to describe the thing I want to point to. But it's sort of like if you're just sitting next to each other, if there isn't any other need, if someone's not meeting their financial needs or their attention needs or their, it's not that those needs can't get met. It's not that other needs can't get met in friendship. But at the end of the day, do you just enjoy sitting next to each other and sharing a conversation over a meal? Is that just, there's an affinity where you're magnetized, you enjoy being with this person. And if your relationships and the people you're spending time with don't have that at the most foundational level and to a degree that makes it sustainable, there's probably going to be a lot of relationship drama. And it's a complicated journey to, keep moving your relationships more and more that way. It's sort of the opposite of codependency, because codependency creates bonds based on needs and, rescuing in the victim, persecutor, rescuer triangle. And, there's lots and lots of kinds of things that come up, and I've walked through a lot of this in my own journey. So if you're kind of mired and figuring out how to get your feet out of that particularly sticky mud and recognize it in yourself, I really honor where you are on your journey and look forward to the point where you ideally can keep moving forward in whatever way is appropriate for you and come to this resting affinity with the key players in your life, because I think that's a really beautiful place to relate from when no one's coming with need, they're coming with want and desire. And from that affinity, it's easier to disrupt people pleasing because people are being in connection because they like each other, because they want to be with each other, not because they're trying to meet some other need and agenda. Although, of course, we may have other kinds of needs met. I really try to be resourceful and not need it, but feeling like someone would have my back and would show up for me, show up big when the chips are down, like really be there for me when it wasn't particularly convenient if I had a really big need, is something that's incredibly high value as a quality in relationship. And I pair that with being, very resourceful and responsible in my own life. And so there's definitely room for give and take around other needs being met. But again, it just comes to this fundamental what you're looking to for relationship glue. And if you've used your psychic ability and your empathy to learn how to be super useful to people, and there's a lot of glue with that, that can make for some relationships that over time have a lot of depletion involved and a lot of disappointment when the energy is set to reverse. So what I mean by that is one of the ways that I participated with people was showing up for them over and over and over again. You're in pain, we'll talk about you, and I'll be there for you and I'll support you. And I assumed incorrectly that I was building this line of credit with them, and if I ever needed anything, they would rush to support me, which in one way was a setup because I wasn't super clear about how people could even do that. And in another way, people who were just really hungry and needy were very engaged with me when I was providing something. But when I stopped because I needed something from them, they were still hungry and needy. So they just went off and found someone else who could show up for them. And I was the one sitting around feeling like they'd broken a deal that they never signed. And it was really illuminating to start to have discernment about whether people were in a more balanced energy exchange naturally and wanted to float that way. Because again, being unskillful with people in my younger years, I tended to find people who needed me and use that as glue for a relationship. And it lacked sustainability. I have a lot of compassion for 22-year-old Katie who is shy and awkward and had all this unmanaged energetic sensitivity, who could get really focused on helping someone and being there for them, and was starting to come into her gifts and her affinity and did that. I have tremendous compassion for her. I'm not making her bad and wrong, but I'm just recognizing that ultimately it didn't really produce the results that I wanted. And so ideally, when someone asks us for something, we start to interrupt that knee-jerk agreement, because if we have some history of people-pleasing, if we have that soul affinity of wanting them to have what they want, if we have trouble asking for something and we want to help other people be good at asking for something, whatever it is, oftentimes we agree before we take counsel with ourselves about whether that's something we can show up for. So the invitation here is to start to know all these parts and what their agendas are, not making any of them bad and wrong, but just noticing that maybe if your fight or flight is activated, you want to bring that down before you promise anybody anything that hasn't happened. And maybe if you make promises and blurt out, yes, of course I'll do it, there may be some where you need to go back and renegotiate. And I'm not a fan of the pendulum swing of just, no, I'm not going to do the thing. If I've given my word, I like to have a conversation that says, I said I'd pick you up at the airport and I can still make that happen, but I really didn't check in with myself and I am behind on so many things. So is it possible that someone else could pick you up? Would that be an option? Or I could pay for an Uber if you don't have someone else. How's that for you? And ideally, if I like somebody enough that I would go to the inconvenience of picking up at the airport, they'd be somebody who wanted, of course, the help getting home from the airport, but also wanted it not to harm me. And that would probably be a very successful conversation. And I would take note that before I blurted out, yes, of course, there's this need for this pause. And that's just a practice thing. It's giving yourself grace. It's an interrupt to a pattern that has a lot of familiarity. There's ego death. There's a lot of vulnerability when you start pausing, checking in with yourself, balancing the needs of the person you care about and your own, and moving thoughtfully with what you offer to other people based on your budget, your availability, what it would cost you, whether you feel inclined, whether the energy exchange is there. If you find that you're rescuing, maybe that's something that needs to be addressed. A therapist can be really helpful. Maybe you're telling yourself a story that somehow out of the many, many, many people in the world, you're the only person who could help them. And I find that people who chronically need rescuing often have a really good knack for finding people who are a little less far along on looking at their own rescue or codependency issues. So I feel like everybody I ever stopped rescuing and overgiving to promptly went forth into the world and found someone else. And one of the profound ironies of overgiving to someone and then stopping is they're probably going to be really, really mad at you. Any relationship where I've overgiven and then I re-corrected very gently, very kindly, that person often ended up really, really not in my fan club. And ironically, people who I've given to in a much more measured, much more thoughtful way are the people who have expressed the most gratitude and appreciation. And I'm like, wow, I didn't even sacrifice. I was just flowing what felt natural between us. And, there's a beauty in that. So there's a lot here. This is a super complicated topic, but starting to know these different parts of you that have agenda with how they spend your energy in relationship to doing what other people want when it's not necessarily what would be optimal for you is a really good thing to start to understand. And one of the reasons that I recorded this is I talk to people and I feel like they either want to put it all in the people-pleasing basket. Oh, I'm such a people pleaser. That's what's wrong with me. Or they put it all in the spiritual generosity basket. That's a little less common. And they're like, but I'm just being a good person. And there's a balance. There's a both and sometimes both are in play at the same time, but teasing those out and differentiating, because people pleasing as a safety strategy is not healthy. It's not sustainable long term. Sure, in the moment, if there's a really angry, irrational person, you don't have to go toe to toe with them. You probably want to be as pleasant as possible while you extract yourself from the situation and possibly call the police when you're away from them. So it's not to say that this could never be a strategy that gets used, but it's at best a very, very short-term strategy. And the long-term strategy is something where you're balancing your needs with whatever the other person needs in a really mature, resourceful, healthy kind of way, because there are often many, many, many options where it's a both and. I can get my needs met, you can get your needs met, and it can happen in a win-win kind of way. And so that's just something to look at, whereas the spiritual affinity for giving joy, for making people happy, for contribution's a beautiful quality, and that just needs adult supervision so you don't get caught up in your affinity for it and overuse it. And kind of the difference is that you may be depleted if you've overgiven, but there's a part of you that's satisfied, whereas with people pleasing, you just don't feel super good on the other side of it, because all you get out of it is not feeling unsafe, which isn't really a benefit. And there's often a lot of pain of the part of you that didn't get to speak up and didn't say something wasn't okay with you. So that can be a quick way. And these can both be present at the same time. So teasing this apart, understanding why you give what you give, and having a healthier and more sustainable way to contribute to other people in a variety of ways is really worthwhile introspection and work. And the practice, give yourself a lot of grace for blurting out something that in retrospect you don't want to do, like the intensity of social situations. This can come up with fibbing too. You can end up saying like something that isn't true, and you can be like, why on earth did I say that? Well, it was a knee-jerk kind of survival, keep the peace, stay safe kind of response. So it just means you were a little off your center, and ideally you go clean it up immediately. You're like, I do not know why that fell out of my mouth, but that was actually untrue, and the truth is this, and I'm sort of embarrassed about it. And again, it depends on the relationship, but that kind of cleanup with people who would make it safe. If somebody's going to start ranting and raving about people being liars and stomping their feet, and they have a lot of emotional debt about liars, maybe not so much. So all of this is very nuanced and complicated. There isn't a set of rules. One of my pet peeves is meme-based spiritual advice, because I feel like that oversimplifies things to such a terrible degree. One of the examples of that is, people who are the hardest to love need to be loved the most. And when I work with clients, I find that there's a spectrum. There are clients that I'm say, you're overgiving and I'd like you to cultivate a little more healthy selfish. And there are clients who are rather narcissistic, and I'm like, turning up your empathy, turning up your putting yourself in other people's shoes, not being so caught up in, your own story to the absence of other people would be good medicine. There are these nuanced directions that could move either way on the pendulum to optimize their results a little more. And for that dreadful person who's the hardest to love, there are certain people who it is great to still be really kind to them. And in other cases, getting really authentic feedback that if you're going to act like this, everyone's going to back away from you, and you get to be with loneliness and alone because you're treating people in a way that doesn't feel good to them, and they're backing away. So could go either way, kindness or feedback. Either one could be really valid depending on the situation. And it's not necessarily yours to know, because I feel like you're overreaching if you're trying to decide that. It's more about coming home to yourself and saying, do I want to back away from this situation and absent myself, or do I want to authentically, with no strings attached, attempt to contribute something? And these are all really powerful, nuanced questions to ask yourself to bring your results with other humans to the next level, hopefully on a far shorter timeline than what I stumbled through as I was working all of this stuff out. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.